When you're training with heart rate, the number on your monitor is not what you think it is. Today we are going to unpack the 10 things that influence heart rate while you're training.
One of the main aspects that's going to impact your heart rate is going to be temperature. So that's hot and cold. First up, it's the heat. The heat is always going to impact your heart rate and elevate your heart rate specifically. So at a cellular level, what's going on is that if the core temperature increases too much, the pH levels in the cells change and essentially the cells die, or they don't perform as they should. And so the body is constantly trying to keep that balance of heat, and so it does that by increasing your sweat rate and by increasing your heart rate to allow for these bodily functions to happen, and that's why you have this elevated heart rate when you're running in the heat. With every sort of degree that increases, there is a different sort of, or an increased response in heart rate as well. So that's the heat. The heat is definitely the main factor that's going to impact your performance and increase your heart rate. The other aspect here is the cold. So this isn't as extreme as the heat. The optimal sort of temperatures for training or racing in is between 11 to 13 degrees Celsius or 51 to 55 degrees Fahrenheit. So it's a lot easier to sort of manage your performance and your heart rate in those cooler temperatures. Actually, that's the optimal. That's where we want to be sitting. But as it gets colder, it's not as drastic as the effects on heat. So your heart rate does elevate slightly, but we can also mitigate that with external factors like the gear that you're using. You can put gloves on, you put hats on, you put tops on, and obviously that can help keep your core body temperature warmer, and so you don't have as much of an increased heart rate response in the cold. As it continues to get colder though, we can't mitigate that by using clothes and gear. That then does have an effect on your heart rate, and your heart rate is going to be elevated because, again, the body is trying to remain in a state of homeostasis. So your heart rate will increase so that the body can increase the blood flow to the skin to try to keep your skin warm and your core body temperature up.
So now that we know how heat affects heart rate, humidity ties in very closely to this. Because we rely on sweat rate or sweating to cool the body down through that evaporation, humidity hampers that slightly. There's so much moisture in the air, so your core temperature rises, you start to sweat a lot more, and because there's so much humidity in the air, there's not as much evaporation happening at the skin level. So blood pumping through to the blood vessels in the skin, hoping to try and cause more evaporation and more cooling, and because of that humidity level and high moisture level in the air, there's not that cooling happening. So it almost becomes this vicious cycle where, because we're not cooling down, core temperature is rising again, heart rate increases, not evaporating, and all the way back, this constant vicious cycle that elevates your heart rate. And that's what you generally start to see when you are running and your heart rate sitting quite high. And it's those kind of things that you also need to pay attention to, understanding that you are going to expect your heart rate to be elevated when you are running in hot and now humid conditions as well.
When you are training with heart rate, in particular on long runs, you can't rely on heart rate later into the run. That is because of a phenomenon called cardiac drift. As we exercise, our heart rate does drift out, and it drifts out in response primarily to the fact that we are losing blood volume when we sweat. So as we sweat to cool down, that water has to come from somewhere, and it typically comes from our central blood volume. That means we've got less blood to pump around the same amount of oxygen and the same amount of supply of energy to the muscles, and the only way the heart can compensate is by increasing your heart rate. So increasingly over time, your heart rate becomes less and less reflective of the exercise that you're doing, and this compounds the longer you run because sweat rates increase and we add in the effect of fatigue. So the way that you get around this is that it's a good idea to use heart rate early on in your race or training session, and that sets the tone for the intensity that you want to run at. And as you go beyond 1 hour, and in particular 2 hours, you become less and less reliant on heart rate leading your intensity.
The next thing that can affect heart rate is stimulants, and there are many stimulants out there, but the one that's going to be most interesting for runners is caffeine. Caffeine improves alertness, it reduces fatigue, it reduces your perception of effort, And also it's believed that it helps the body mobilize fatty acids for metabolism, so it can improve performance in that way. What caffeine does is that it basically activates the body's sympathetic nervous system by activating the release of norepinephrine. Norepinephrine is responsible for what is called your body's fight or flight response. So this is basically priming your body for action. And what this does is that in the short term, it constricts blood vessels, and this increases your blood pressure and also raises your heart rate. And this is how your body gets ready for any kind of activity. In natural senses, when you're looking to run from something, but it's very important for performance and for activity. So the net result of all of this is that caffeine will increase your heart rate initially in the first 5 to 60 minutes by about 3 to 5 beats. But after a while, caffeine seems to have the opposite effect, where it actually results in what's called vasodilation, and it does this by stimulating the release of nitric oxide. Nitric oxide is very well known for being used to calm people. So it opens up your blood vessels, and this occurs in the smooth muscles, in the vasculature of the smooth muscles. So in activity, caffeine actually helps your body deliver oxygen-rich blood to muscles, and that probably helps in how it improves activity. So the thing with caffeine is that you need to time when you take it and how much you take. So the dose, it depends obviously on the size of the individual. The small individuals might require less caffeine than big individuals. And in terms of timing, caffeine reaches peak concentration after about 45 minutes. So you want to take the caffeine about 45 minutes before you do any activity. And this performance boost helps for running, for strength activity, for high intensity work, as well as low intensity work.
Sleep is another factor that is going to impact your heart rate, whether in training or racing. Again, if we're touching on the body trying to remain in a state of homeostasis, as humans, we use sleep to self-regulate ourselves with regards to stress. And if you're not getting enough sleep, your body thinks that it's in a state of stress, and so all of the factors are going to be a little bit heightened. And the first of that is your heart rate. And because the heart rate is essentially the port of call to then get all the other physiological functions happening. So if you're not getting enough sleep, it's very likely you're going to have an increased heart rate in your training session. And so please make sure that you're getting enough sleep in the evenings.
Stress has a major impact on heart rate, and this happens particularly in races, but also for everyday training sessions. In a race, you're already in a stressful environment, your body's already excited and primed, and therefore we have to take that stress into account when we set heart rate, if it's a variable that you want to use when you are doing races. During everyday training, your body cannot interpret the difference between stress that comes from family stress, work stress, someone in your family being ill or sick, you just having a bad day, if you've almost been in a motor vehicle accident or some kind of something has gone wrong in your day. Your body cannot differentiate between that stress and the stress of normal training. And that means that when we are in highly stressful situations, tracking things like resting heart rate, recovery heart rate, and using heart rate to set our baseline, in particular for easy runs, needs to be adjusted, and stress has to be accounted for in your everyday training program and taken note of, so that you can tell the difference between increased heart rates that are being caused because you are moving into overtraining or because you're going through some short-term acute stress in your life.
Another factor that affects your heart rate, whether it's in training or in racing, is fatigue. What we expect from heart rate when you are fit or you are getting fitter is that your sub-maximal heart rate at a set pace, so let's for argument's sake just use a 6 minutes a kilometer or 12-minute mile set pace, and you will see your heart rate or sub-maximal heart rate usually pretty consistent. The fitter you get or the better your aerobic function, over time you will generally start to see that sub-maximal heart rate start to drop slightly and then stabilize. Now when we are fatigued, that heart rate will actually be elevated. So that will really be a sign for you to say, hang on, I might need to dial back a little bit, because at a heart rate, or rather at a pace that I'm comfortable at running usually, where I know my heart rate is at X, now it is suddenly quite elevated. And usually you start to see an elevation, or when you start seeing your heart rate being about 8 to 12 beats higher than normal, that is an indication to say, hang on, I think I could be either getting sick or just a really good sign of I just need to dial things back a little bit. I might be a little bit tired. Instead of doing an interval session, maybe turn that into an easy run or take a day off just to allow the body to recover a little bit, and you should be good to go from there.
I'm sure you've felt this. You're standing on the start line of a race, it's that nervousness, the butterflies that are happening, that adrenaline that then goes, that's a heart rate response. And so we call that a stress or an arousal. And so when you're standing at that race, that's adrenaline that's happening. And so what's going to happen is your heart rate is going to be elevated. It's very much why we don't suggest that you use heart rates during racing, because you're going to start in an already elevated heart rate state, and this is a normal response, right? So we just see it as positive because we love running and racing is great and fun, but the body sees it as a stress. In the same way, I'm sure that a zebra is standing and watching a lion staring at it, its heart rate response is also going to be up. The body is essentially preparing for something, and so when you're standing at that race, getting ready to go, there is going to be an increase in your heart rate before you start. And so that's why we want you to almost try and just calm down. And there are different strategies you can use to help that heart rate response just calm down before a race or before an event. But those take practice and time. And just know that that is a very normal heart rate response.
So another thing that affects heart rates is illness. Now, it actually is normal for your heart rate to rise when you're sick. This is just your body responding to the infection. So it does mean something is wrong, but the increase in heart rate is because of things that are happening to you. So what happens when you get an infection is that you normally get localized inflammation around where the infection is. And what happens then is that your body will dilate the blood vessels around that area and also make the blood vessels more permeable. So this will then increase blood flow into that area, and it will also increase your heart rate. And this also allows white blood cells and other cells of the immune system to get to the site that you are, that is being affected. And of course, we also know that when you get sick, particularly with viral infections, one of the things that happens is that you get a fever and there's this rise in body temperature. And so that rise in body temperature is going to cause your heart rate to rise, because your body's going to want to cool down the core temperature. And it does this by increasing blood flow to the skin for you to sweat. And one of the outcomes of all of this, the increase in in body temperature, an increase in blood flow and increase in sweat, is dehydration. And again, when you get dehydrated, your blood pressure drops and your heart rate rises to compensate for this, to ensure that you still get adequate blood flow. So all in all, when you do get sick, you will naturally see a rise in heart rate, and it can be as much as 5 to 15 beats a minute.
Age is one of the biggest factors that impacts heart rate. As we get older, in particular, maximum heart rate goes down. This is in response to the fact that our connective tissues become less and less flexible as we get older. So our heart rate comes down, and the body's ability to shunt blood around by vasoconstricting and vasodilating our blood vessels and arteries is reduced. There are lots of age-related formulas that try and help you compensate for this decreasing heart rate as you get older, but most of them don't work. Watch this video now to find out why.